Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family and readers. Today, Dick and I are sitting and chatting with Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist. He's the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and so much more. Vijay has asked me to cut his bio short. So Vijay, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing amazing. Thanks a lot. It's great to see you guys again. And thanks a lot for running all my pieces on your site.
Yes, it's such a pleasure.
We're delighted to publish you. And it's good to see you again. As we just said, the last time we saw you was 15 years ago at the California Democratic Caucus meeting. And you gave a wonderful speech then, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I was just sort of agog at the way that you fire hosed us with information. I mean, considering that you've written 40 books, I can see now why you just had so much information to share. And so much of it is just so insightful, really helps a person who's trying to figure out this nutty world that we live in. It really helps us to take all the pieces and put them together. So Dick, do you want to ask Vijay a question?
Sure. You publish a lot about the Global South. And you publish how the Global South is falling out or running away from the orbit of the United States and the West. And I guess that's in part because they're tired of being pushed around, and in part because they are fearful of losing access to Russia's resources. How do you see that working out for them and for the West?
You know, it's really interesting that we're starting with this because it's preoccupying me, certainly. Why? Why now? It's not like suddenly a spate of left-wing governments have arrived in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and these left-wing governments, for ideological reasons, have decided to stand up against, the West, imperialism, and so on. No, not exactly, or not even at all. The Indian government, for instance, is a right-wing government. The government in India, I know them, some of them personally, the people in the cabinet, they would never use the word imperialism. They don't even think of the word imperialism, So why is the Indian government not falling in line with the United States? It's a very instructive question, because much easier to understand or ask the question of India than Brazil, because in Brazil you can say, well, Lula is a person of the left, center-left president of Brazil. Maybe this is ideological. But if you look at India and understand why India is standing up, then you can actually better understand Brazil, because it's not for ideological reasons. There's a couple of things at play. Firstly, you're quite right. For the first time in many decades, I would say many decades, the government in India has understood that the national interest of the Indian government and the Indian people is not identical to the interests of the United States government. So when the US government, which has tangible interests in prosecuting the war in Ukraine, when the US government says to India, you got to send weapons, you got to condemn and so on, the Indian government thinks about it and says, wait a minute, our interests are not identical to yours. We need to not only buy energy from Russia, but Indian private companies and the government energy company, the Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, ONGC, own assets in Russia. They own tangible assets. So the sanctions are not good for India's national interest. That's the first thing. The second thing, the second reason why India is not buckling to US pressure, and believe me, there's been a lot of pressure on India. The reason India is not buckling, the second reason, is that India has seen, and I think we all see if you look rationally, that there is the creation of an alternative system that is actually economically useful, not only for the Indian government, but for Indian business. And that is the system that to some extent has been driven by China, but mainly it's been driven by the locomotives of the South, Brazil, South Africa, India, and so on. They understand that they're doing a lot of trading with each other. There are actually comparative advantages for these countries to integrate their economies. And they don't really need, in a sense, or it's not only that they don't need the US market, they are not confident that the United States will, for perpetuity, be the buyer of last resort of all their goods and services. There's just too much debt in the US. It's not clear that the United States can buy everything from the rest of the world. So a country like India has to look for different markets, different economic ties, and so on. For these and many other reasons, India is simply not buckling. And if India doesn't buckle, then it becomes much easier to see why Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, again, not a man of the left, why Ramaphosa even quickly said, we're going to pull out of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to allow Putin to come to South Africa. Now, he has since backtracked and said that in the treaty that the South Africans signed to enter the Rome Statute, there are loopholes and they don't need to pull out of the ICC to allow Putin to come in. But that's standing up against the West. And then, of course, Brazil. So it's national interest trumping the interest of the United States, which used to pretend to be the universal interest. And then it's the fact that the US economy is just not strong enough to buy everything from everywhere. And this has made them start to think realistically.
Right, right. So before we started, before I pressed the record button, we were just sort of having an informal conversation about the US left and whether there is or is not a left movement, you know, why we lack such power. So, I mean, there are so many of us that want to end global warming, that want to address the needless killing of people due to gun violence, that want for there to be Medicare for all, but we just can't seem to get any movement in that direction. Can you talk about whether there is or is not the beginning of a left movement in the United States and what it would take, if there isn't, to get one?
I mean, I wouldn't like people to feel, pessimistic about the situation. Let me give you two quick examples. And I know people can debate this, till the sun goes down and the sun rises again. But the first is that, remember, just a few years ago, there were these massive Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. In fact, those were the largest mass protests in US history. They were much larger than the protests against the Vietnam War. I mean, it's extraordinary. Those protests were not just in Los Angeles, in New York, in Chicago, and, in Atlanta and so on. They were in small towns in Nebraska, in places where, the Black population is basically non-existent. People came out with signs. I mean, when I sometimes travel in the US, I see in places where literally there is no diverse population, but there'll be a sign in the window that says Black Lives Matter. Very interesting to see that. So there is a potential of people to stand up against injustice in millions, very large numbers. Secondly, this found some political expression in the two campaigns by Bernie Sanders to run for president. He galvanized a lot of people. Now, you can debate whether Bernie is a real leftist or not. I'm not talking about all that. I'm talking about the carrying capacity of bringing millions of people into the political domain on a platform that's reasonably left. And that germinated into democratic socialists and so on. See, there's a problem that I think is there in the United States, which is that there's a sectarian left, a small left. It used to be dominated by people out of the tradition of Trotsky. There's some of that sectarian left. There's some of the kind of Maoist left, that came out of the new communist movement after the 1960s, the Line of March and so on. There are these pockets of left here and there. What there wasn't was a direct connection between these important left groups, these, let's call them sectarian, although they're not all sectarian in their attitude and so on. But there's a lack of connection between many of these groups and mass struggles. So, for instance, in other countries, take India, where my formation took place, the principal Communist Party has 1 million people in it, which in the context of India isn't very large, 1.4 billion people, but still 1 million well-trained cadre in India. But then there are tens of millions of people organized into the trade union movement. the peasant movement, the agricultural workers movement, the women's movement, the student movement, youth movement, and so on and so forth. These organizations are linked to the Communist Party. The Communist Party has mass organizations. So what this allows is the habits of mass organizing and mass contact. In other words, the habit of going out there and building the mass line. I think in my experience in the United States, this needs to be rebuilt. And I am seeing it now, rebuilt by some political forces. They are trying to go out there and create the habits of mass struggle. Because of McCarthyism, because of the attack on the left, what happened to the Communist Party was that they followed a policy of entryism. Send your best cadre to go and become leaders of the labor movement. Send your best cadre to go and lead in the black struggles and so on. But the connection between the party and the labor movement was subterranean. It was buried. You see, that's different from having your cadre involved in mass struggles, open, direct, very honest kind of struggle. And that was a consequence of McCarthyism, that the link between the left parties and the mass struggles had to be, in a sense, buried underground. That needs to come above ground. I mean, it's going to take some time to build an active left presence. The Democratic Socialists of America tried to build that, but you got to also give it to the people who joined the DSA. They tried to build a mass left formation without experience. McCarthyism really broke the chain of experience. I mean, these were a lot of young people struggling to do something. There were very few older people who were willing to give them wise advice. There were a lot of people sniping at them. You're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong. This kind of negative criticism is the opposite of wisdom. Wisdom means coming to people where they are and helping them, teaching them, giving loving advice of how to build, how to become a better person on the street, And I think this is one of the big problems. I feel this disconnect between the political organizations and the mass struggles. But the capacity of the mass struggles is there. Black Lives Matter, the Bernie movement, and so on. The ability of people to create left formations is there. We keep seeing them come up over and over again. It's the connection, I think, that has to be built patiently and with a lot of love and care. Gardens don't grow by themselves. They need a lot of love and care.
Yeah, I think that's what we see as well. I mean, we're parts of lots of different organizations here in LA that are toward the left side, but everybody's got their own little fiefdom. Everybody's got their own little division, and there isn't like a central core. It kind of defaults to the Democratic Party, which isn't leftist, and the DSA and Progressive Democrats of America that attempt there, but it ends up kind of toothless. And even Black Lives Matter. So a standalone strong movement had some real reasons to get going, but it's going to be hard to sustain that issue over time, I think.
Yeah, particularly across transracial and all of the other isms, we don't seem to be able to focus on one thing that we all want to accomplish, regardless of race, regardless of gender, and then we come together. We haven't been able to do that. And I was particularly inspired and hopeful during after the tragic murder of George Floyd. But, I've been around for more than 6 decades. And I kind of felt like, well, in a couple of months, this is all going to go away. And still to this day, we couldn't pass the George Floyd Act. So who knows what will come of it, but so far, not much.
But I'll say this. So I'm old enough to have participated in the Vietnam protests and to some extent in the civil rights protests. That's some of my early memories. And I was among a whole bunch of people that was a central part of their life for some certain length of time. And now, these 6 decades later, I see some of those same people who are still out agitating for the good of the world. And I think that may happen with what happened now, because there's been some decades in between there when people went to the disco and they weren't too much involved in what was going on in the world. So I'm of the two of us, I'm always the glass half full guy.
So one thing that you just said, Vijay, which I find very exciting. You talked about how the movements in the other countries really trained people to engage themselves in participatory democracy. It charged them, and it gave them a sense of what it means to take the reins of control of their own lives and their own communities into their own hands. And that's what's lacking in the United States. I was listening to a talk that you gave about China, and you said something about poverty was eradicated in China through the public action process. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Let me give you an example of that. In the state of Kerala, in India, which has about almost 40 million people, 38 million odd people, there's a communist government that has been in power now for about 6 years or so. But that's not the important part of it alone. We could come back to that. At the beginning of the pandemic, when the lockdown took place, in the city of Tirunathapuram or Trivandrum, which is the capital of Kerala, the youth organization of the communists, the Democratic Youth Federation of India, decided, listen, let's do something interesting at the beginning of this lockdown. We're going to divide up the city into zones, and then our units are going to go door to door with clipboards and say, okay, apartment number 3 in building number X, ding dong, do you need anything? Masks on, do you need anything? Are there any elderly people? Do you need us to go and buy medicines for you? Do you require food? Do you have, XY? It took down, these people need food. Say, give me the money, I'll go buy your medicine and so on. And so the youth did this for months on end during the lockdown. Very interesting, Well, one of the young people, 21 years old, her name is Arya Rajendran. She became very well known because she was out there on the street right through doing mass contact, but also helping people at the same time. When the next election took place, she stood as a councillor in one of the wards, and she was elected councillor, age 21, youngest councillor. And then, because she had become so important in the city, during the lockdown, these youth were heroic, and she was one of the leaders of the youth. The councillors elected her to be the mayor. So she is now the mayor of the capital city in Kerala. She's now, I think, 22 years old or 23, but she was elected the youngest mayor. Now, this is a good example of mass action. What do I mean by that? You see, this is a left government, and the government did a lot of things. They went out there and they made swift ability to get people food, and they used the scale of the state to operate. But that didn't mean that public mass action or mass contact in this way was to be, set aside. It's interesting. And I want to come back to this a little, but in China, neighborhood committees did the same thing. Chinese cities are organized around neighborhood committees. Neighborhood committees went door to door and said, do you need anything? Do you want anything, etc. I've asked people in the US, did anybody knock on your door and say, do you need something? See, neither did civil society, this word that the funders use a lot in the US, and nor did the state. The state didn't come and test anybody. The state didn't go anywhere, but nor did public mass action. So in the United States, people have got into this habit of relying on the state. The state will do it. I remember once living in Providence, Rhode Island, and I was in an apartment, and I looked out of the window and I saw a man hit a woman in the apartment next to mine. So I went running down the stairs. I mean, it was a horrible argument, and then he really hit her hard. I went running and I rang all the doorbells in the next building. Somebody came. I went to the apartment, knocked on the door. Now, I knocked on the door, and the man was yelling at me from the other side of the door, didn't open it. Then a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes later, I was insistent. The police arrived, and they threatened to arrest me for disturbing the peace. And I said, I just saw this. And they said, it's none of your business. You should have just called us. You see, the state must intervene between people. People cannot deal with each other. That's the evisceration of public action. You can't build a civilization or a society when people no longer are able to deal with each other. You see this all the time in advanced countries. In advanced countries, people are not supposed to intervene when they see something bad. Look at the slogan: see something, say something. But to who? To the authorities. You're supposed to call the authorities in. You can't do anything. I see somebody behaving badly, I'm not supposed to intervene. In fact, if I intervene, I might get into trouble. You got to call the authorities. So this is the attitude. In fact, it's funny how people in the US say, oh, this country is authoritarian, that country is authoritarian. But this is an authoritarian mentality.
Yeah.
You don't want to have society take care of its problems. You want the state to come in. That's an authoritarian mentality. It's very weird. In China, as an example, the neighborhood committees get involved. Interesting. When the Western press wrote about this, they said, oh, this is a sign of neighborhood surveillance. Well, of course it is. It is neighborhood surveillance. They were going and doing surveillance. Excuse me, can we take your temperature? It is surveillance, but is it negative? Not in my opinion. Actually, a government abandoning its people, a people who are used to being taken care of in a sort of nanny state, that is actually more authoritarian than where people come and ask, do you need anything? Let me take your temperature and so on. So mass public action is key. And if the state is not capable, people need to start doing it, at scale. I mean, it's not enough for 5 anarchists to do some kind of mutual aid. That's not enough. In the city of Los Angeles, millions of people, you have 3 or 4 bands of anarchists doing good work, mutual aid. That's not enough. You need mass action. You need hundreds of committed people going door to door saying, hey, listen, this is my neighborhood. I'm going to take care of my neighbors.
Yeah, so Los Angeles does have a system of neighborhood councils that was kind of a progressive change, pull power away from the central government. But the problem is, and I think it's a mental problem, they didn't have any power to do anything. They could hold some nice meetings, they could listen to the local policemen, tell them what's going on, but they didn't make any decisions on which roads should be paved or what you should do about schools. I know there's an effort under our new mayor, Karen Bass, to ramp that up, and we'll see if that goes. But I think it's the problem is up here in the head, not in the structure that's created.
Yeah, we've been enculturated to behave in a certain way,
Right.
to rely on the professionals, to rely on the state to come in and take care of everything. I mean, like from birth through all the way through college, you have the authorities just kind of telling you what to do. And that's the way that we behave in every aspect of our lives.
But I think there's a certain agitation now because there's been so many police shootings and so much publicity about them that people, they don't really want to call the police for, things that they might have done so in the past. In fact, locally, we're trying to have unarmed social workers come and answer certain kind of questions. And there might be some momentum behind that.
So do you have another question that you want to ask before we close? And we're trying to stay under a half hour, and I think we're rubbing right up against that.
No, we're good. So yeah, well, you write a lot about Africa, and for whatever reason, I've never been there, but I have a lot of interest in it too. And it's kind of the same story as before. A lot of African countries are pushing back against the French military and American involvement. How do you see that playing out?
It's very complicated. I've been for many years going back and forth through the Sahel to, parts of Southern Africa and so on. Firstly, I want to say that it's a fundamentally underreported stories that, there are lots of African journalists who try their best to cover these stories, but they find hard to get published even on the continent. I have to say, now, I guess, my God, it's 93 to now, 30 years ago, in Windhoek, Namibia, there was a meeting of African journalists. Out of that came World Press Freedom Day, which is May 4th. Those African journalists in 1993 were complaining about the lack of publications for them to be published. And now it's even worse with media concentration and so on. So I've been interested very much in the Sahel region, For a number of reasons. One, I just find that area of the world beautiful. I mean, it's just at the lip of the Sahara, just south of the Sahara. And, it sort of joins the Sahara to very lush forests and so on. But the main thing is the politics in that region of the people is extremely, extremely turbulent and interesting. For instance, in Mali, there was a great democratic leader, Alpha Omar Konare, in the 1990s. Mr. Konare won an election. He was a distinguished man of the left, had by the 90s said, look, the left is nowhere, so I'm going to be basically a democratic, maybe even a centrist person. He begged the US, saying, please forgive our loans, fight with the creditors, give us a haircut. Konare said, I need to solve the problem of the Tuareg, the rebellions in the north. I need to deal with the fact that there are fights in the central belt of Mali between pastoralists and the herders and so on, the Fulani. I need to solve these problems for which I need resources. I need to build a healthcare. And Clinton just said, forget it. You got to pay your debt. There's no relief for you at all. And Konare basically couldn't exist. He couldn't last the way through, couldn't put an agenda forward. Well, the various mutinies inside Mali continued apace. When France and the United States destroyed Libya, a lot of the turbulence from that destruction entered Mali, and various smuggling gangs, Tuaregs, Al-Qaeda, whatever, took over almost half of Mali, up to just south of Timbuktu. At the time, the French intervened, Operation Barkhane eventually, 2013. And it was a brutal time because nobody was paying attention. Lots of civilians killed and so on. But also the French started negotiating with Al-Qaeda. I mean, things were quite bad till recently. And then we saw in 2020, the beginning of a cycle of coups take place in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, cycle of coups. In fact, in Mali and Burkina Faso, there were 2 coups in each country. Why? These were not generals coupping against a progressive. This is not the coup against Thomas Sankara in 1987. These are junior officers who basically represent ordinary people in their countries. They are struggling to find a pathway out of it, and the more they get sanctioned by the West and others, the more anti-Western feeling arises. But that doesn't necessarily mean they are radicals of any kind. These are just lower middle class young men who are desperately trying to do something good for their families, communities, their countries, including secure their territory from Al-Qaeda, smuggling groups, Tuareg, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is they are having a tough time. And in the middle of this, they just told the French, you got to get out. Now, the French are out of many of these countries, but the British and the Americans are there. People don't know, but the United States has the world's largest drone base in Niger, in Agadez, Niger. It's an enormous base. That's the reason why Mr. Blinken, Secretary of State, he visited only 2 countries in Africa in his tour, Ethiopia and Niger. North of Agadez, toward the Sahara Desert, is a town called Arlit, a very interesting place. Also, little remarked, it is the center of the world yellow cake uranium extraction. You may remember during the lead up to the Iraq war, there was a quote-unquote rumor put out there that Saddam was trying to buy yellow cake uranium from Niger. And then a former US ambassador went to Niger, investigated this, said it's not true, wrote up a dossier. And then the Bush administration revealed that his wife is a CIA agent, Valerie Plame. You may remember this. This was about the Niger's yellow cake uranium. Well, most of the uranium that France uses in its electricity generation comes from Niger, from Arlit. In fact, my surprise in Arlit was to find so many French troops guarding the city. So, this is a contested battlefield. Very interesting, guys, because the US keeps saying, China is colonizing Africa. They keep saying this. I've never seen Chinese soldiers in Africa, except there's a naval base in Djibouti, which is out there as part of a UN mission. I have never seen Chinese soldiers in Africa. I've seen a lot of US, French, and British soldiers in Africa. I don't know who's colonizing what or what the definition of colonialism is these days, but big military base in the middle of Africa. And the fact that it's not reported. A few years ago, I think 3 or 4 US Marines were killed in Niger. There was a firefight on the Nigerian border. In the US Congress's Foreign Relations Committee, I was struck. A senator said, I didn't know there were US troops in Niger. And I'm thinking, you've got the world's largest drone base there, and you, who are supposed to have oversight over the military, I mean, do your homework before the hearing. And please don't embarrass yourselves. But in fact, I don't blame that fellow, because I think most people in the United States have no idea the kind of footprint the US military has on the African continent. It is pretty scandalous, the amount of money spent there. Give you another point, the amount of money the United States has spent bombing and destroying Somalia is greater than what it would take for Somalia to have a budget.
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad. In full disclosure, I happen to be a very close friend with a person who was the Prime Minister of Mali briefly, Sheikh Modibo Diarra. He and I worked together at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where we met 30 years ago, and we worked together for about 20 years before he went back to Africa and became the Prime Minister. And those young people that you're talking about arrested him, and he was removed from office.
No comment.
Wow. Well, thank you for this wonderful exploration of world history, and I don't know what our future holds, but there's something that's inspirational about the way that you talk. It gives me hope. I guess that's all I'll say. Dick, do you want to have?
Yeah, well, so Vijay, we're honored to publish you. We look forward to when we get a hold of one of your articles. And if you have any particular thing you want to get out, give us a ring, and we'll give you another ring and have another conversation. I don't think the world is going to get well enough that we can be quiet.
Yeah, and I'm always happy when we have someone who is an academic, who writes as much as you, that talks to our readers, because most of our readers are just, average people. And so, mainstream media is not giving us this information.
Right.
And we're always happy to give them a source of reliable, good, well-researched information. So thank you so much, Vijay Prashad, for being with us. And we hope to see you again.
Of course.
So
thanks a lot. Both of you are terrific. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.